Pokemon Red and Pokemon Blue version released in the United States in 1998, about 2 years after the initial release of the first Pokemon games in Japan. The rest of the world saw these same Pokemon games released in the United States shortly after the release in the US, however nowhere else in the world besides Japan received the original first release of Pokemon. As I'm sure you guys already know, the first Pokemon games released in Japan were Pokemon Red and Green version, while the rest of the world saw Pokemon Red and Blue version dropping the green. This wasn't exactly a simple renaming of Green version to Blue for Western audiences, as the original Red and Green were actually quite different from what the international audience received. I'll mainly refer to just Green version, by the way, to avoid any confusion, but keep in mind that when I say Green version, I really mean the original Red and Green version released in Japan way back in 1996. So why is this and what exactly happened? To give a brief timeline of the development of the original Pokemon Green, it initially started in 1990, and due to the complex nature of the game at the time, mainly due to elements such as trading, the games weren't finished until 1995. Green version was set to release in Japan the holiday season of 1995, before being pushed back to February 27th, 1996, which is now known as Pokemon Day. It isn't exactly known for sure why the game was delayed about 3 months or so, as the game's in-game copyright date still says 1995, which shows this was a rather late last-second decision. It is speculated that Nintendo wanting Game Freak to split Pokemon into 2 different versions might have had something to do with it though. These original Red and Green games are also the versions of Pokemon that are responsible for the infamous Lavender Town creepypastas, which adds to their legacy as well. Strangely enough though, just 8 months after the initial release of Red and Green in Japan, Pokemon Blue version launched in Japan. This was effectively a third version of the same game, however it wasn't exactly the same as other third versions, so to say, we've received later on in Pokemon, such as Emerald version or Platinum version. This was an updated version that mostly just fixed a few glitches and added in better sprites for the Pokemon. This new Blue version was also only available through a special mail-in order offer, which was hyped up by the fact that a new Pokemon in Mew was added to the game. Around this time in late 1996 was also when Pokemon really started to pick up in popularity in Japan and take over, which led to discussions of them releasing Pokemon worldwide. Now at this point, it only made sense to base the international releases of Pokemon on the existing Pokemon Blue version. This was just an upgrade after the original Red and Green version after all, which just made more sense. The issue with this, however, is they still wanted to release 2 separate versions of the game in order to promote trading and battling between the trainers, of course, and boost sales. They ultimately decided to turn the Japanese version of Blue into Pokemon Red and Blue version, dropping Green entirely. I can assume that this was due to Charizard's popularity over Venusaur, and they decided to keep Blue version since it was based off of the Japanese Blue version anyway to make things a bit simpler. This did end up causing a little bit of confusion, however, in the Pokemon world, as the main rival in the games and manga is named Green in Japan, but Blue in the rest of the world, essentially swapping names with the female trainer who is Blue in Japan, but Green everywhere else, and no matter what name I say, somebody will always correct me saying I'm saying the wrong name. These games all eventually led to Yellow version, which was essentially the third game in a row of the same exact region. Don't think that would go over too well today. And then of course the rest was history, and from here on out we've gotten these same games from Japan with no changes in the titles. So now you might be wondering, what exactly are the differences between Green version and the Japanese version of Blue, as well as the international versions Red and Blue? On the surface, it might not seem like too much, but if you dig a bit deeper, Green actually has a lot more differences than you might have initially thought. The first and most obvious are the sprites. Taking a look at some of the original Pokemon Green sprites, and they look pretty different from what they were in the international versions. The main reason was to make the sprites look a bit more like how Pokemon looked in the anime, as the anime came out after the games in Japan, and although most look better in the newer sprites, there are still some oddities. We have Ghastly, which looks nothing like Ghastly in either versions of the game, and then we have sprites like Aerodactyl, Mewtwo, and Blastoise, which in my opinion look more closely to their anime counterparts in Green version than in their updated sprites. Overall, this was a step in the right direction, and it does make most of the Pokemon more in line with how they look in the anime, especially considering the fact that the anime came out much closer to release of the games in the West. But some of these Green sprites still just look weird. Aside from the sprites, the overworld was slightly altered as well. The Cerulean Cave, or the Unknown Dungeon as it used to be called, had a more complex design in the original Green version. This was toned down for a blue version, as we can assume that it was a common place for people to get lost in, and it just made it a lot simpler. A handful of hidden items were moved around as well, mainly to make them a bit easier to obtain and to circumvent some other glitches that were involved with them, and outside of these changes there really wasn't any main changes to the overall region. Some animations for moves were changed from green version, though mainly due to them having too many flashes or too many moving objects. The amount of PC boxes in green was only 8 as well, as opposed to the 12 international release versions, and each box originally held 30 Pokemon instead of 20 as we saw in later releases. This still totals to 240 total Pokemon being able to be stored in the PC, so I'm unsure why they even bother making this change if it doesn't change the PC storage numbers. As for the Pokédex, there aren't any changes when it comes to dex numbers or missing Pokemon or anything like that. However, there were some errors in green version that needed to be fixed. For example, Nidoqueen only weighed 6 kilograms in green version, which was later corrected to 60, and Geodude only weighed 2 kilograms, which was later corrected to 20. There were also a couple of changes when it comes to translating the game from Japanese to English, some of which are actually pretty interesting. Now I'm only going to focus on the English translations here, but if you want to read more about translation changes into other languages besides English, check the link in the description to the Cutting Room Floors page in Pokemon Green. The first one we have is one of the Sylph scientists stating that he is a part of a different branch of the Sylph Corporation located in Polnaya, Tunguska, hopefully I'm saying that right, which is speculated to be a reference to the Tunguska River in Russia. In the English versions, however, the scientist refers to his branch being located in Tixi, which is a real-life city in Russia, which backs the speculation that the original Japanese scientist is referencing a real-world place in Russia. I always find it really interesting when Pokemon references real-world places, since all of these take place in a fictional region anyway. Next up, we have the famous diary in the Pokemon Mansion in Cinnabar Island, which references Mew. This entry also refers to a real-world place in Guyana. However, the main lines of text were changed to fit more in line with what we saw in the first Pokemon movie. In Pokemon Green, the diary talks about the creation of Mewtwo, but only uses the words watashi, which means I in Japanese, implying that only one person or one scientist created Mewtwo. As we know from the movie, this isn't exactly the case, as there were actually multiple scientists responsible for creating Mewtwo, so this was changed to use words like we in the English release to fit more in line with the original movie. The final bit of differences I want to discuss involve glitches, which are a huge part of Generation 1. Some glitches, like the old man standing on the roof in Cinnabar Island Gym for no real reason, remain in all versions of Red, Green, and Blue, Japanese, American, and International. But some are native to the original green versions only. For example, in the Seafoam Islands, there's actually a cliff that the player is able to surf on despite it not actually being water, in order to reach Articuno without solving that pestering boulder puzzle. Now the glitch that I found the most interesting, however, from the original green version is the Sabrina glitch. Now in the original green version, if you lose to Sabrina's gym battle, the game will think you beat her anyway. This means that next time you re-enter the gym, the post-battle text will trigger, giving the player the TM and the badge of the gym. Considering Sabrina is one of the hardest gym leaders in the original Pokemon games, this was quite the oversight by developers, as pretty much anybody debugging the game who lost to Sabrina should have been able to check this. There are some other glitches and other general information about these differences on the cutting room floor again, which is linked in the description. So in the end, the original Pokemon Green and the original Pokemon Red and Blue that we received internationally are largely the same game, but there are still some key differences. It almost seems like Pokemon Green was an early beta or alpha of Pokemon before the game was properly finished for international releases in Red and Blue. I use the word properly rather loosely here, as there are still plenty of glitches with these games in any version you play, but it's still fun to look back at the history of these games post-launch and how much they've changed since. I've always been really interested in Pokemon Green. I remember when I was a kid, I was about 8 years old at the time. I want to say this was right before the release of Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green. I remember being very interested in Pokemon Green version when I first found out about it on various Pokemon forums I would go on at the time. The fact that there was a Pokemon game that was never released outside of Japan really piqued my interest, even though it was largely the same game that we received in the West in Pokemon Red and Blue. I remember I really wanted to get a copy of the game. I actually ended up getting a Japanese copy of Leaf Green a few months ahead of release, which was way cooler in my opinion, but it wasn't until I was much older that I actually ordered a copy of Pokemon Green on eBay, and I've played it a little bit since. It's still a really nice piece of Pokemon history, and I'm glad that I can share more information about it with you guys.